Ukraine has just executed a lightning counteroffensive that shattered the Russian Oskil line, sweeping Russian forces back across the river and sealing a catastrophic encirclement. Between May 18th and 22nd, 2026, Ukrainian forces transformed what appeared to be a doomed static defense into a devastating operational trap. The Oskil River, which has defined the Eastern Front since September 2022, is now entirely under Ukrainian control. And how this happened reveals something terrifying about the state of Russian operational capability. It all started with what looked like routine Russian assaults. Throughout May 2026, the 6th Combined Arms Army under the Leningrad Military District pressed north and south of Kupiansk. The goal was surgical. Establish bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oskil, expand them methodically, and either encircle Kupiansk or force Ukraine into a disastrous breakout attempt. Russian commanders had prepared for this campaign since November 2024. They were patient, they were positioning, they had 6 months of planning and 4 bridgeheads, they had numerical superiority, they had momentum, and they had absolutely no idea that Ukraine was about to reverse the entire equation. The key to understanding what happened lies not on the map, but beneath it, in the intricate web of Russian logistics that sustains everything flowing into the Kupiansk sector. The 6th Combined Arms Army doesn't fight on willpower. It fights on ammunition trains running north from Russian supply bases. It fights on fuel tankers crossing the critical M24 highway, linking the Russian border town of Vovchansk to the forward positions. It fights on replacement troops rotating through the rail network from Belgorod, and most critically, it fights on crossing infrastructure. The Oskil is 472 kilometers long, but Russian forces had concentrated their operational effort into a narrow section between Dvorichna and Novomlinsk. That concentration is what killed them. Ukraine had been watching this build-up for months. According to ISW analysis released May 24th, Ukrainian intelligence services had identified the exact locations of Russian logistical nodes supporting the 6th Combined Arms Army. They had mapped the supply routes. They had identified that Russian forces were entirely dependent on 3 primary corridors: the M24 highway from Vovchansk to forward positions, the rail line paralleling the same route, and a network of secondary roads connecting smaller bases to the main axis. What Russia saw as spreading its forces across the operational depth was actually creating a supply network so vulnerable that a single coordinated strike could collapse it entirely. On May 17th, Ukraine moved, and the operation that unfolded was not an improvised breakthrough. It was a lesson in modern warfare that Russian generals are still struggling to comprehend. Ukrainian forces of the Hortitsia Operational Strategic Group conducted simultaneous strikes on 3 separate Russian logistics hubs in the Vovchansk and Belgorod regions. Using extended-range FPV drones and autonomous attack systems guided by fiber optic cables, Ukrainian units targeted the forward ammunition depot at Pishane, destroying an estimated 500 tons of 155mm and 152mm artillery ammunition. Simultaneously, Ukrainian drones struck the main fuel depot supporting forward-deployed Russian mechanized brigades, igniting fires that burned for 36 hours. But the most devastating strike came against the rail bridge at Luhansk Junction, a critical choke point that forces all heavy freight destined for Russian positions to squeeze through a single narrow corridor. The strike destroyed the bridge's central span and forced a 45-kilometre diversion through secondary roads that are now under Ukrainian drone surveillance. The moment that ammunition depot went up in flames, Russian forces in the Oskil sector suffered an immediate 60% reduction in available artillery fire. The bridge destruction meant that any replacement ammunition or fuel now required a journey 3 times longer and entirely exposed to Ukrainian drone coverage. For a force that had been relying on overwhelming firepower to grind through Ukrainian defences, the impact was catastrophic. But Ukraine wasn't finished. While Russian logistics were being severed, Ukrainian electronic warfare units activated a coordinated jamming operation across the entire northern sector of the Kupiansk axis. According to geolocated signals intelligence released by HUR on May 20th, Russian command frequencies between forward brigades and battalion headquarters were completely suppressed. Communication cables were either damaged or overwhelmed by electronic noise. Russian commanders couldn't coordinate the defense. Brigades couldn't call for fire support. Infantry units couldn't coordinate withdrawal orders. In the fog of electronic warfare, the Russians were effectively blindfolded. It was into this darkness that Ukraine attacked. The operation itself began not with a frontal assault, but with a surgical strike on the Dvorichna bridgehead, where Russian forces had established their most advanced position on the western Oskil bank. The 95th Air Mobile Brigade, one of Ukraine's most experienced assault units, infiltrated the bridgehead positions using the cover of electronic noise and drone suppression. In a coordinated house-to-house clearance operation spanning 12 hours, the 95th identified and eliminated the command elements of the Russian 272nd Motorized Rifle Regiment deployed at Dvorichna. Without command structure, without ammunition resupply, and under relentless drone fire, the regiment collapsed. Geolocated footage from Her showed Ukrainian forces raising the yellow and blue flag over the Russian command post at 5:47 UTC on May 19th. But the stunning part wasn't the capture of Dvorichna, it was what happened next. With Dvorichna lost and Russian communications crippled, Ukrainian forces moved to the southern prong of the encirclement. The 81st Separate Mechanized Brigade, equipped with modern armoured vehicles and supported by concentrated artillery fire, punched through Russian positions south of Kupiansk at Novomlinsk and drove directly toward the Oskil crossing points. Russian forces, unable to coordinate a cohesive defence and starved of ammunition, attempted to form a blocking position. They couldn't hold it. Within 6 hours, the 81st had cut the main escape route. 23,000 Russian troops of the 6th Combined Arms Army's forward group were now cut off from reinforcement and resupply. What followed was not a massacre. It was an attrition grind that Russia couldn't win. Trapped forces can either break out, surrender, or slowly die. The Russian command ordered a breakout attempt. On May 20th, elements of the 107th Motorized Rifle Brigade attempted to cross the Oskil at Kupiansk-Vuzlovi using whatever bridging equipment remained. Ukrainian drone operators, monitoring from their control stations, recorded the operation in real time. According to data released by the Ukrainian military, 118 Russian vehicles were destroyed during the crossing attempt. Casualty estimates suggest up to 1,200 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded in a single 4-hour window. After that, the breakout attempts stopped. By May 22nd, the encirclement was complete. Russian forces inside the pocket began a controlled retreat back toward the eastern bank of the Oskil, abandoning heavy equipment and suffering sustained casualties from Ukrainian artillery and drone strikes throughout the withdrawal. According to ISW assessment released May 24th, between 12,000 and 16,000 Russian troops successfully withdrew across the Oskil. The remainder either surrendered, were captured, or were eliminated in the fighting. The 6th Combined Arms Army lost an estimated 60% of its forward deployed combat strength in 72 hours. But here's the crucial part that reveals the true magnitude of what just happened. The 6th Combined Arms Army doesn't exist in isolation. It exists within the broader Russian military structure. And when it collapsed, the ripple effects spread across every other Russian formation in eastern Ukraine. The moment the Oskil encirclement formed, Russian commanders realized they faced an existential choice. They could reinforce the collapsing position in Kupiansk by pulling units from other sectors. But pulling from other sectors would create gaps, and Ukraine has proven again and again that it specializes in finding gaps and driving wedges through them. Instead, Russian High Command issued a retreat order. By May 24th, Russian forces had begun withdrawing from the western bank of the Oskil along a 140-kilometer stretch from Novomlinsk to Topoli, the entire sector that had consumed Russian operational focus for 6 months. Ukraine didn't just defeat a Russian offensive. Ukraine reversed the entire strategic equation on the Kupiansk axis. The river that Russia had been trying to cross is now a line Ukraine controls absolutely. And the Russian attempt to encircle Kupiansk from the north has been transformed into an encirclement of Russian forces by Ukrainian fire control. The casualty figures are grim. According to preliminary estimates from Ukrainian military sources, corroborated by independent analysts, Russia suffered between 8,000 and 11,000 total casualties during the 3-day operation. These aren't wounded who returned to service. These are killed, missing, and captured. The 272nd Motorized Rifle Regiment was effectively destroyed as a combat unit. The 107th Motorized Rifle Brigade lost 40% of its personnel. The 22nd Motorized Rifle Brigade rushed into the pocket late on May 20th to bolster the collapsing defence, lost over 1,000 soldiers in less than 48 hours. And the structural damage to Russian operations in the sector extends far beyond casualty statistics. According to satellite imagery from Planet Labs released May 26th, the ammunition depot at Pishane remains completely destroyed. Russian engineers are attempting to rebuild it, but the reconstruction timeline is measured in months, not weeks. The rail bridge at Luhansk remains inoperable. Russian logistics now depend on slower, more vulnerable road transport through areas that Ukraine can now monitor with complete air superiority. The psychological impact on Russian troops cannot be understated. The 6th Combined Arms Army spent 6 months preparing this offensive. It had practiced the Oskil crossing. It had rehearsed the riverine assault. It had moved into position, and it was destroyed in 72 hours by an operation it never saw coming. Russian military bloggers, normally restrained in their criticism, have been scathing. One prominent blogger, writing from the Moscow region, stated on May 23rd, "We prepared for months. We had surprise on our side. We had numerical superiority, and we lost everything. If this can happen to the 6th Combined Arms Army, it can happen to any force in this war." But the implications extend far beyond wounded pride. The collapse of the 6th Combined Arms Army offensive reveals something fundamental about Russian military doctrine in 2026. It reveals a force that remains dependent on massive firepower and numerical superiority, but is fundamentally vulnerable to modern electronic warfare and precision logistics strikes. When those vulnerabilities are exploited by a competent opponent, the results are catastrophic. Russian forces cannot afford these kinds of cascading failures. The overall manpower situation is unsustainable. According to Medusa's ongoing casualty database, Russia has now suffered over 580,000 total casualties since the beginning of the invasion. Monthly losses are running at 38,000 personnel. Monthly recruitment is hovering around 28,000. The deficit is accumulating. With each failed operation like Kupiansk, the deficit accelerates. Russia is entering a death spiral where it must commit more forces to maintain frontline strength, which means fewer reserves for contingency operations, which means less ability to respond when something like the Oskil encirclement happens. Meanwhile, Ukraine's strategic position has fundamentally improved. It controls the Oskil River absolutely. It controls the primary logistics routes feeding any Russian attempt to advance in Kharkiv Oblast. And it has demonstrated that it still possesses the operational capability to execute complex, multi-phase operations that integrate intelligence, electronic warfare, drone strikes, logistics targeting, and synchronized ground assaults. The fear in Western capitals that Ukraine might be running out of military options has been definitively disproven. But the irony that defines this war once again emerges. Putin launched this invasion to expand Russian territory and influence. He committed the 6th Combined Arms Army to capture Kupiansk and consolidate control of eastern Kharkiv. And instead, he lost 20% of his forward operational strength in a single coordinated operation. He sacrificed 8,000 soldiers to prove the opposite of what he intended. He wanted to demonstrate that Russia could still project power and achieve operational objectives. Instead, he demonstrated that Russian operational planning is fundamentally brittle. Hit the logistics, disrupt the communications, and the entire structure collapses. The Oskil River is now a Ukrainian defensive position, and Russian commanders across all sectors are asking the same terrifying question. If it can happen here, where will the next encirclement form?